of a monthly network we run called Public Services 2030, and it's a home for a conversation about public service reform, where we work with a whole series of partners to bring brilliant speakers like we have today into the conversation about how we can improve public services and move forward for the future. And Ben, our head of social policy, leads the public sector network and is chairing the event today. So just a quick thank you from me. Do stay for a drink afterwards. We'll all be around to have more chats. But welcome to Demos.
I'm going to pick up a microphone. It doesn't do anything for you guys. It's for the people on the audio. So it's a slightly strange experience. But anyway, so yeah, I'm Ben Glover. I'm the head of social policy at Demos, and I lead our work on public services. Welcome to everyone. Thanks so much. It's lovely to see such a packed room. Before we begin, I just want to give a big shout out to the sponsors of the Public Services 2030 network. There are 7 of them. I'm going to do my best to remember them. So we're working with the Centre for Public Impact. We're working with CIPFA, who we've got Ian from CIPFA on the panel today. Working with More Than a Provider, Read in Partnership, and Policy at Manchester, who are the impact wing of the University of Manchester. Also really happy to be working with 2 knowledge partners on the network, the WEA and the Institute of Employability Studies. Delighted I got through all of that. So yeah, welcome everybody. Bit of housekeeping. I've got my eyes on the clock. We'll finish at 7:15 promptly. We will kind of mingle for drinks if you want to stay and chat and ask us any questions and grill the panelists if they can stay for that as well. Fire exit is through the sort of room that we call the cubby hole, but basically there's a fire exit sign. Go through there if the alarm sounds. We've got a lot of time for Q&A, and we'll take questions from the floor, and people online who are watching, we can also kind of take some questions. So just put them in the chat. So get your question minds thinking now. What are we actually talking about? Today we're talking about public services and devolution. Public service reform is back on the agenda. We are very happy about that at Demos. We think it's great to see politicians, after a bit of a kind of break from talking about public service reform, to see that on the mouths of them, increasingly so. And so too is devolution. I think we've got that rare thing in British politics, a cross-party consensus on the benefits of devolution, and that being the direction of travel. Maybe some of the panelists will kind of challenge me a bit on that and say one party is more interested or committed to it than the other, but I think it's fair to say that exists, whether or not it's in the Brown Commission work of the Labour Party or the Levelling Up White Paper, if anyone remembers that. So yeah, there's a cross-party consensus there. And I think we kind of think that's really important for public service reform for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the trailblazers, the new kind of pioneers who are working and forging a new public service paradigm are at the front line, and they're in councils across the country. So it's, that the gap between the rhetoric and the discussion in Whitehall and councils is quite vast, and that kind of suggests we've got to lean into devolution if we want to actually see public services reformed. There are also some quite good arguments, I think, around public service reform and devolution being very complementary. So something that we often talk about in public services is the idea there are lots of silos, and busting those silos at national level, something civil servants in Whitehall has tried for some time. I was a civil servant. I've seen that trying to happen. It doesn't really work. So does devolution actually lead to that kind of joined up approach to public service delivery that we've seen Whitehall trying and failing to deliver over such a long period of time? So with all of that in mind, tonight we're asking, is devolution a friend or foe of public service reform? I'm really delighted to be joined by 3 great guest speakers this evening. To my left, we've got Kim McGuinness. Kim is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria. She's also running to be Labour's candidate for the North East Mayor. To her left, we've got Alex Norris. Alex is the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up and the Member of Parliament for Nottingham North. To Alex's left, we've got Ian Murray, who is the Director of Public Financial Management at CIPFA. CIPFA are the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. Yes. And Ian has more than 20 years of experience working in and around the public sector. So without further ado, I'm going to go to Alex first for some opening remarks. What's Labour's thinking right now? How can devolution really support public service reform? Over to you, 5 or so minutes, then we'll go to Kim, and then we'll go to Ian.
Thanks, Ben, and evening, everybody. I'm conscious because we've had some brilliant events this week in the kind of democracy space and community power space that a lot of us have been following each other around for the week. So now I love seeing all of you, so that's not a problem, but you might hear some of the lines again, and that again isn't a problem because that's politics. It's if you hear the same jokes again, I'm slightly concerned. But I do want to start by saying a really sincere thank you. I look around here and I see so many people that have helped me, helped Lisa, helped Labour's front bench in general to formulate our policy. And that is so important. Whatever you think about party politics, that's so important in a democracy because the government has, the brilliant talents of the entire British civil service behind them. We in the opposition are, to say the least, a thin operation. So we have to be with you, learning the best from your research and your insights. So thank you so much for being so generous with that. And Ben, to answer the central question, yes, devolution is a friend of public service reform. So working on the assumption that we want public service reform because we want to make our communities better. We want to deliver better services. We want to tackle inequalities. We want to, improve the country in which we live in. Well, let me tell you, all of those things, particularly tackling inequalities, they are an inside job. They are not something that, we from this postcode can command and control. God knows we've tried. That doesn't deliver the outcomes that we want to. It is an inside job. You have to have devolution. You have to have that transfer of money and power to our nation's regions and sub-regions in order to let them use that local insight, that expertise, and the partnership with their communities in order to drive that. It's great we've got Kim next to me because, Kim has modelled that in her role as Police and Crime Commissioner in Northumbria. So yes, absolutely devolution is a friend of public service reform. So how might we go about doing that? Well, first of all, there is, and this is important to say because it's too rare in politics, but there is consensus on devolution. There are very, very few voices now, not zero, but very few voices arguing against the idea of a transfer of power from Whitehall to Town Hall. That actually we've seen in those communities that have benefited from that, the difference that that's made. In fact, obviously, we take a much longer view of this back to Scotland and Wales devolution. This is something that we've been into for a while and has delivered. We should want that for everybody. If those powers and those resources are effective in Greater Manchester, then they would be in Greater Nottingham too. We need to move away, and I think this is one of the areas of distinction between ourselves and the government from picking winners from those deals. Yes, of course, I'd say, and I know, there's many things that I may say that cause division, but ending the beauty parades or begging bowl culture or Hunger Games, whichever kind of characterization you want for that, we know that is a debilitating way to fund public services. Instead, we need to have longer term settlements that are targeted at need. But also we want to go deeper with the range of things that we're sending out for that local leadership. So Keir set out in January in the Take Back Control Act around skills, around employment, transport, housing, culture, and much more. And we were delighted to see many of those things pop up in the Trailblazer deals subsequently. And we will continue to push that conversation because we think that the government needs to go further. And as I say, allowing more to access that, because we shouldn't want to stop at 40% of England at the moment being covered by such arrangements. But crucially, and this, and again, this feels like a really great time to be talking about this after yesterday's incredible event at the Guildhall, which I know many people were at because there were many hundreds of people at. Devolution is not purely an exercise in the transfer of power from Whitehall to Town Hall. If we do that, that in itself will be a good thing. It will lead to better decisions. It will lead to a degree, I would hope, of people feeling that they have more control, but it will not mean that we've addressed the tests that the public, either explicitly or in other ways are setting for us. 2014 Scottish referendum, 2016 Brexit referendum, the fact that when you open your phone, open social media, the quality of the public conversation, people are telling us they want greater control and say over their lives. If what they get for that is only a transfer of power from the centre to probably a new sub-regional body further away than their local authority, well, we won't have passed that test. So we have to have double devolution. And I'm so pleased to see that, I've played over my adult life, I've played a lot of empty rooms talking about community power. And I'm so glad that those rooms are no longer empty. That shows that we are winning those arguments. And so, you will have seen, obviously, Lisa announced at the end of last year our community right to buy, building out from the Localism Act on the community right to bid, so that we can keep those assets, those community assets, in the communities that need them and need them to underpin their lives. But also to go further, I know we've got many colleagues in the room who've got enthusiasms in this area around the community involvement in public services. And I think that's germane for the conversation that we're having today, that we have to get the public's voice back into those rooms in order to shape those services so they really reflect that common existence. And again, we've got a platform to build on in the sense of, the 2011 Act, the right to challenge. Well, we know that's too adversarial. We know that's too broad. That hasn't worked. We can make that something more meaningful. And we are, it's no secret, working in that space. And again, I'm grateful for the many people in this room who've helped us with that. And I see Matt here from Local Trusts, and that obviously makes me think of Big Local. We have to understand that in that conversation, those community rights, as boldly as I've stated them, would widen inequalities at this point, because the communities who've got the best mix of skills, the communities who have the best resources, the communities who probably have the most time, might not be the ones actually who were particularly targeting at those, in that levelling up conversation. So we have to find ways to value the time of people who are struggling, to put that infrastructure around to help support them, to lead those programs. We know it can work, because Matt and his colleagues have been doing that now for a decade. So there's lots to go at in there as well, I think, that we can be really excited for the future. So I think I'll stop there. I think I've landed it in time, Ben. Yes, I think the answer to the question is definitely yes. I've given a sense of perhaps where we might be thinking at the moment, but very, very keen to hear from colleagues what more they think and want to hear from us. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Alex. Plenty to chew over in the Q&A there, but over to you, Kim, in the meantime. And yeah, if you're right to hold the microphone,
yeah, no worries. It's very strange holding a microphone. It's not making a noise. Thank you very much, and again, thank you for hosting an event talking about this. And I think we said up front that we're probably going to agree quite a lot, actually. And Alex may have done this double act a couple of times, and it won't surprise you that I agree with pretty much everything that he says. And I also do, genuinely, as somebody who lives in the region, who is the furthest away from Westminster, I agree with the direction of travel that the leadership of the Labour Party are forging, because it's so fundamental. But just to sort of disagree ever so slightly, I think the question is devolution friend of devolved public services? I would say that it isn't a friend yet, not to date, but if we get it right, it will be the best friend of public service, because outside of the devolved nations, outside of Manchester and London, and then powers like myself, devolved powers like PCCs, which I know we're not necessarily here to talk about, although we can explore a bit more. Outside, so most of England, devolution hasn't really got very much to do with public services, actually, at the moment. And if we look at my own area, which is the North East, we've got a limited devolution deal in the north of Tyne. And to me, it is the picture of Conservative-led devolution. So every day you've got a mayor who turns up for work and his staff ask him, how much money do you want to how much money do you want to spend on supporting business? And there's no bus service to run, and there's no selective licensing to help renters, and there's no health oversight. And yes, some of that's been sorted to a degree in Manchester and London, but for the vast majority of England, we're not there yet. And I feel that that's the direction that we need to go in. And that will change a little bit with the next version of the deal that we've got in the Northeast. But the truth is that the truth is that at the moment, this government, I don't think, trusts the region to deliver public services. I think we're a year away from a Labour government, and I hope we're a year away from a Labour government. And as I've already said, I'm very comfortable with the direction of travel from a Labour government. But I think regardless of who does form the next government, for balance, ministers do need to ask themselves what it is that, does need to ask themselves what is the why about the powers in devolution. Is it just that it's a tick box exercise to make people feel a bit more empowered? Is it just a way to support business growth? Or is it fundamentally to rethink how we connect with citizens and give them control over the decisions that affect their lives every single day? And it won't surprise you that I think that it has to be the latter. And if our why is the latter, if devolution is a mission to end the days of civil servants, I know you were one, in London, who are acting in a minister's name, telling us what's best for us, then devolution has to include public services. Now, the risk to devolving public services. So if I'm going to give you the counter argument, and this is the argument that's been made over and over again, is the idea of the postcode lottery of public services. And I think many will tell you, and I think there has been historically some of this in the Labour Party as well as in the Conservative Party. I think there's consensus now that devolution is broadly good, but it hasn't always been the way, that you can't create a level playing field if you don't have central control. And I suppose to a degree, there's been an element of truth to this, but there's two key challenges to the claim that devolving public services is a risk and risks a postcode lottery. And the first is that until recently, we actually haven't really devolved to single accountability. So to a mayor, for example, or to a PCC. And when, for example, NHS waiting lists have been lower or higher in different places, there was no one person held to account at the ballot box. With a mayor or with similar devolved structures like PCCs, the public can kick you out if they don't like the results. And it's as simple as that. The second argument is the damage that we do when we let Whitehall make all of our decisions for us. I don't think Brexit was a rebellion against the structure of Europe or European commissioners. It was a cry, as I think Alex has touched on, it was a cry of rage against a system that in reality says that if you didn't go to the right school, if you didn't have the right job, then you don't really get a say. And right now, I think it's pretty fair to say, from where I sit in the northeast, as far away from Westminster as you can get, with the highest levels of child poverty anywhere in the country, that levelling up has been a failing project. It's failing because government wants to spend money on big infrastructure and the people on the ground want more comfortable lives and better public services, and those two things don't necessarily always match. And I know that's exactly what it's like. I know exactly what this feels like because it's what my family went through in the 80s and the early 90s. We didn't need a new shopping centre opening. We needed our schools and hospitals levelling up, and that's what we got when we got a Labour government in 1997. And in 2024, I think we need to repeat that success while avoiding the mistakes that we made when we had that centralised control. We need to trust people to elect, and if needed, to kick out somebody who is directly responsible for the public services that allow people to thrive. And so, yes, I think public services need to be devolved. And if we don't, then what's the point, really?
Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to a little indulgence before I get to the. So I'd like to take you back to the 12th of September, 1912. Winston Churchill is giving a speech at a meeting organised by the Dundee Women's Liberal Foundation. So the contentious topic of the day is Home Rule in Ireland. And that's the crux of what Churchill is addressing in his speech. He's frequently interrupted by a group of suffragettes, and he actually has to pause a number of times while members of that group are ejected from the meeting. But between these interruptions, he sets out a vision for a federalised United Kingdom. He talks about establishing 10 or 12 separate legislative bodies who would be entrusted entrusted by Parliament to discharge a number of functions. These included bodies in Lancashire, Yorkshire, the Midlands and London. And in concluding, and I really don't have a passable Churchill impression, so you'll forgive me. He says, "The prospect, I am bound to say, does not seem extravagant to me. The vision does not seem to me at all disquieting. After all, we may be very little islands, but we have a very large population, and the affairs of 45 millions of persons demand far closer attention and far more intimate knowledge than they could possibly achieve from one imperial parliament." But the history of devolution in these very, very little islands goes back a long way. And let's be honest, Churchill's perspective, they're no means the earliest views on centralisation and decentralisation. Actually, the whole thing runs through our political history. But generally, with acknowledging with some of the movement that we've seen in more recent times, but generally we've defaulted to centralisation in the UK. And I think it is probably, it is time for us to revisit that for lots of the reasons that Alex and Kim have shared. And so whilst the passage of time, I suppose that's odd, isn't it? Because actually, if you look at the fundamental thrust of that vision, and the passage of time means we're talking about closer to 70 million people than 45. That key concept that the sort of the specific needs of people and places are better understood by people in those places, and your policy response to those needs can be more effective. Well, that's quite well regarded and seen as having an awful lot of merit. Obviously it's obvious the answer then. Devolution is the friend of public service reform, and we should devolve more. Well, maybe, I think. So the danger is that we see devolution as the policy objective. And I think if we start with devolution as the objective, then we're probably approaching things from slightly the wrong way round. It's a mechanism for delivering effective policy reform, and it has lots of positives, but it can't be seen as the end in its own right. And I think this is where devolution has an important role to play in the reform of public services in this country, because at the end of the day, public services is about that interaction between state, people, and place. So as well as trawling the internet for Churchill's views on decentralisation, I've also looked at some of the work we've done at CIPFA over the last decade or so, and actually running through all this work is that key, is that key theme. So whether it was devolution summits we hosted back in 2015, or some of the more recent work we've done looking at how regional inequalities have been addressed in 4 international cities, you do come back to that fundamental principle, which is it's a mechanism to tackle the issues, not the solution in itself. We do, though, think there are some key themes which can secure devolution's role as the friend and not the foe of public sector reform. And this isn't an exhaustive list, so you need an overarching vision. What is the policy objective? You need to have clarity about what the desired outcomes are, and ideally you have that articulated through a compelling vision. So you have something that people can get behind. You need shared political will and partnership. You have to set aside political differences, and actually in that there are some really key roles. So often anchor institutions are key, and those anchor institutions don't have to be public sector bodies. Those anchor institutions can be key employers, they can be people, education, universities, people who have a vested interest in your area, in your place. Key players, metro mayors and PCCs, I think, are really good examples of providing that focal point that Kim talked about, and also that I think that accountability, there's no replacement, is there, for sort of charismatic leadership when you're trying to break new ground. We need to look at how national frameworks interact with local frameworks. So industrial policies, immigration policies, those are set at a national level, but you need to think about what flexibilities can you have in a region or a place to step away from those. And we also need to look at fiscal regimes. I think importantly, we need to think about responsibility versus accountability. In the UK, we're very good at devolving responsibility. We're not very good at devolving the accountability that comes with it. And I think that's really important. Quite often public services at the moment are framed about what they deliver to who, not what are the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve through that activity. Alex touched on long-term settlement. We need that regardless of devolution. I think at the moment we have short-term funding, and that prompts short-term thinking. I think it's just inevitable. I am an accountant, I'm going to say that. And actually lots of the examples we've looked at internationally had really long-term funding commitments. So some of them, so Leipzig in Germany, looking at a 15-year funding commitment for what they were doing. Cleveland in the US, we're actually looking at timescales of 20 and 30 years. So you need to get that buy-in, you need that commitment, you need that level, you need that certainty. That funding needs to be adequate, but it also needs to be responsive. And I think this comes to the point about, is this an exercise in redistribution, about reducing inequalities and levelling up, or is this about creating competition between regions? And I think one of the big flaws and one of the constant complaints about what's happened with levelling up funding over the last with the current government has been that areas have bid for relatively small pots of money in relative short term. There's been a lot of cost and effort with no certainty that you're going to get anything from it. And actually, we just need to change that. We need to, and even if you looked at combined authorities, I think the budget is good news in terms of starting to consolidate some of that funding. But if you looked at how combined authorities are funded at the moment, it's relatively small and decreasing pots, and that's not necessarily helpful if you're trying to deliver a set of outcomes in an area. Local knowledge, I think, is really important. What are the strengths of your place? What are the strengths of your area? And how do you build on those? How can those be built on and repurposed? So we looked at Nantes in northwest France as an example, which has a strong maritime tradition, which has been repurposed to look at aerospace and other industries. So what is it that an area already has going for it, and how can that be built on and repurposed? Like anything, monitoring and evaluation. I did say I was an accountant. I was also an auditor. But Yeah, that's really important. That regular sense checking of how you're doing. So, are you achieving what you set out to achieve? And if not, being able to make flexible and pragmatic decisions against that overarching guiding vision. So, if you're experimenting, there's that, there is a trick where you need to fail and learn fast. And I think we have to accept that's going to need to happen. And then I think finally, building on some of the things that that others have said, diversification. So I think too often we've framed devolution in terms of economic growth, and actually we need to think about the totality of a place and the investment in culture, spatial development. What you need to do is establish places which are outstanding and renowned places to live, places that you want to live, work, and bring your kids up in. And if we just focus on economic development at the expense of those other things, then we're not going to get the richness of what devolution has to offer. So to conclude, I think the prospect does not seem extravagant, and the vision is not disquieting. But by placing decision-making powers, and I suppose by placing decision-making powers in the right hands and in the right way, devolution is a really important means for delivering public service reform, and definitely a friend.
Thank you so much. I wasn't expecting 1912 and Churchill now, but that was riveting. Thank you so much.
The Google
ChatGPT, yeah, great. So I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege and just ask a couple of questions to the panel, and then we will open up the floor to you guys. I wanted to put something to Alex around cross-party consensus and sort of direction of travel under a Labour government. Get the crystal ball out. We're a big fan of cross-party consensus here at Demos. You read that levelling up white paper, and I dread to think about the amount of hours and painstaking work that has got into that, which I think is actually a pretty good analysis. I don't think there's that much that most people in this room would disagree with on the analysis. So levelling up seems to be, at least with the government, abandoned or degraded or downgraded. I don't know what the right word is, but is Labour going to see itself as the party that continues levelling up and the devolution direction of travel that this Conservative government is taking us in, or are you looking for a kind of a radical break from the current approach, or is it somewhere in the middle, or none of the above? Yeah, I just want to know.
I don't know what's left after that, but no, I mean, because we have to understand that we're going to inherit a settlement, and one that in England has developed over a decade, but actually across the UK over a much longer period of time. So you're not going to treat this as a day zero, get the pen and paper out and write the thing that I've probably had in my head my entire life. That is a very bad way to do it. Actually, looking at the white paper is quite a canny way to think about it, in the sense that nothing to disagree with in the analysis. The analysis is right. Everybody thinks that. Yeah. The actions, the goals, okay, well, that I think could do with a degree of sharpening and probably freshening up. The actions towards those goals was always kind of a bit of copium to pretend that actually there was a plan and there's never been a plan. So I think that the kind of the core analysis is there, and I think we would seek to build on it. So, for example, those three tiers. Well, okay, what I'm talking about is essentially a fourth tier, isn't it? It's those powers plus some more. Yeah. So that's easy enough conceptually to understand, and then we want to move everybody up there much quicker towards that top end. So actually, I think you have to take these things as a building block and to go from that. So the great thing is already, and this makes this really loads easier politically. Kim's proving this every day. Like this is so much less of a leap of faith now. And the great thing of those who are kind of furthest in the vanguard, who are doing more, and I might sometimes say, I would like that for Nottingham, I really would. But they're proving the concept. So that is all pushing us in a positive direction. So I think building on that rather than throwing it up in the air is what the circumstances require.
So a sort of, picking up maybe where this government has left off, potentially, you'd say?
Yeah, well, picking up from where we find, yeah. And I mean, the finances, that's probably a place where I think, but even now, you're seeing that recognition in government as well, that the approach has to change, clearly.
Cool. I'm going to ask something to Kim, if that's all right. There are a lot of kind of tedious objections to devolution that I don't really want to rehash, because everyone in this room has probably heard them millions of times. But one does continue to bug me, and that's around accountability, with an eye on some of the misdemeanors up in the northeastern Teesside. It's kind of just interested in your reflections on the risks potentially of of devolution, and the fact that turnout is poor, and I think there are arguments around devolution can potentially grow participation and democratic accountability, but there's something in my mind that keeps me up at night on this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Kim.
So, yeah, that's so tempting to you're desperately trying to draw me into a deeply political attack on Teesside, which I'm going to resist. But yeah, I mean, accountability, and do you know, I think here's the thing, it works both ways. So as I said, the thing with directly elected people like PCCs and like mayors who are making direct decisions every single day is if it isn't working, you get rid of them. And in some respects, we've got to be really good at holding these people to account. And I think that's really important. As somebody who is one of those people now and wants to be one of those people in a different job, I am more than happy with that. However, I think what's really, really important is this point that Ian made about responsibility versus accountability. And what we've got at the moment is a government who are presiding over that kind of Hunger Games approach. It is definitely a beauty contest. It's a lot of biddable cash. And then they're kind of holding the pen on whether or not the performance suits their objectives, as opposed to whether the objectives of the people that live in these devolved areas are met. And I think that is really vital. A really, really good example of this in my current role at the minute has been around this antisocial behaviour fund that they kind of made a big song and dance about a couple of months ago. And this was framed as the new levelling up. Now, I could get really into how it's completely upside down to say if you tackle antisocial behaviour, you'll level up. Come on. If you level up, if you make people's lives better, you will cut crime and you will cut antisocial behaviour. And we know that it's all that way up, and it was nothing more than a PR stunt. But something that happened through my office, and I'm definitely telling tales out of school here, but I'm not really bothered about that, is that we went to them and we said, actually our antisocial behaviour hotspots on our public transport network. And they went, oh yeah, but we can't measure that. I was like, sorry, what? You're going to tell me that I can have this money to spend in my area to make it safer? It's exactly the same with violence reduction unit funding and what we call GRIP funding. They tell us where to spend it. They tell us what the hotspots are. The government, Whitehall. It is bonkers. Yeah. So, we've won the argument and we will be able to spend it on transport. But the first answer is, yeah, but we know better. You don't know better. You can't see it. I can see it. The people that live here can see it. The people that live here are telling us every single day what the issues are. And so, if you make a person accountable, let them be accountable. And I think that's really, really fundamental.
Ian, do you have any thoughts, Nick?
I mean, absolutely. I think you can't. You have to have that accountability at a local level. I agree with what Kim's saying in terms of the ultimate arbiter is the electorate and the ballot box. I do think you need some mechanisms in between electoral cycles to make sure that you've got checks and balances in place. On the sort of the funding thing, I think there's been a general pattern of creating relatively small pots of money to pursue specific policy objectives, but which are never really going to deliver the outcomes that those policy objectives are intended to achieve. And I think we could look at with lots of examples. Actually, in policing, there's a controversial around money for tasers, for example, which is a really contentious subject. But the Home Office created a fund with a view that we could, if forces wanted to, they could apply for the money and they could effectively arm their officers. So I think there are all sorts of examples where that hasn't. That hasn't and won't work. I also think that in that there is, and again, the accountant in me, there is something about how money gets raised locally. So actually, we do collect taxes locally in this country, but they don't actually really get used locally. And any discretion, actually, local politicians have very little discretion over even things like council tax, where yes, you can increase your council tax by 2%, but you've got to use it for social care, or you can't go above a certain level, or you trigger a referendum. And even things which I think are potentially sort of not that contentious, things like tourist tax. For some reason, if you travel, you check into a hotel and you see on your bill a tourist tax, but we're really reluctant to think about these things in the UK because we think that there'll be lots of unintended consequences. So I think part of the accountability actually does come back to the money, and if you start doing excessive ring fencing of funding centrally is not helpful if you're going to empower people to come up with the right solutions for the people that are going to hold them to account. And that's something I think we definitely need to look at. I think that we've gone too far as a country in that respect.
Thank you, Ian. I think that sets us up well for some hard questions for Alex on fiscal devolution in the Q&A section. Just like my last question for Alex, then we'll open it up to the floor. Like double devolution, what do you mean by that? What does it look like? Is it a return to coalition era localism? If not, how is it different from introducing a few laws, community rights that will be quite poorly used? How does Labour give some kind of meat to this concept, which we're very enthusiastic about at Demos, but what does it really look like in practice?
I might, if you don't mind, because I've got the microphone, just say on the accountability point.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. What we've seen, it's clear now. There's no one who disagrees that we now need to know more what's going on in Teesside. And what has exposed, again, putting to one side the specifics, it's exposed that we've got National Audit Office that is currently saying they can't do that. The Prime Minister referring to a body that really doesn't currently exist. There is a clear gap there, because as always, we're trying to find the national solution to the problem as well. If we have, these things are going to happen as you have more and more of those structures making more and more decisions. There's going to be more and more sense of, are they the right ones? And once again, as so often, we do have a lot of these answers already in our councils. We have, how many authorities it's north and south of Tyne, isn't it? The North East Mayor now, seven. So each one of those with an overview and scrutiny committee.
Yeah.
I know from my own time as a councillor, those were difficult rides, and mine was an authority that was pretty much exclusively Labour. Those are skilled people who do these things day in, day out. Let's use those. Let's harness those things that are there already. So on double devo, it's definitely not a return to coalition era approach to it, because it didn't work, did it? But it doesn't mean that conceptually that was wrong. But what it's saying is that we want to see that passage of power downwards from the centre doesn't just stop at combined authority or even local authority. That we think still, I know this from my time in local government. I felt that we did things for communities they could have done for themselves, all the while biting our thumb because the government were doing things for us that we could have done for ourselves. So I do think, and again, we're in that policy formation stage, so I'll take on all comers on this and all ideas. But I do think a rights-based approach is probably a good one, because otherwise, if you're asking for just cultural change, where it's done well, perhaps already it will be done well, and those if they don't want to, and therefore I think it will land. I think you have to, and again, I'm stealing from Matt, and he can speak for himself, but there are models about how you can hold that more effectively, what organisations need to exist. I don't have any, but I'm enthusiastic about town and parish councils, but significant parts of the country, including my own, aren't town and parish. So you have to have alternatives, but that's not beyond the wit of man. I could tell you who kind of community covenant, I'm stealing someone's, probably Josh's idea there, what's the community covenant organisation in my community would look like. That's conceptual. Again, I think pretty easy. You've just got to commit to the idea that you want to give more power and responsibility to those organisations, because they're even one step closer at an estate level to people's lives, and that if you take people seriously and get them involved, then you will get some, you will improve your decision making. I will say, just as a final point, it is right on what was said there about devolution not being the end goal. Of course it's not. It might be people like me, I'm a devolution nut, so maybe that's something I see. But we also shouldn't lose from this a belief, or it's certainly my belief, that the act of taking these decisions, the act of having a greater say, is really good for communities too. In and beyond what those decisions are, it's healthy. And our democracy is really struggling. That's no secret. This is one of those really major ways we can try and build confidence and participation again. So that's why I think it's that important.
Awesome. Anyone else have anything to say on double devo? Kim or Ian, do you want to say anything on?
So I suppose, so I would agree with everything that Alex has said. I think we always think of it, it's in the word, isn't it? So devolution is how, central, national, and then I think there's also a conversation though about where things sit. So sometimes it will be appropriate for things to sit at a regional level. I think combined authority is a good example actually of where part of that is about local authorities that, you know, letting some things go. So acknowledging that actually some things you need to do at scale, and there's always going to be that balance between the sort of efficiency and effectiveness, I suppose. So there will be some things which might be better done at a regional level because you can take you can do it at scale. You can have a more efficient delivery model. I think if we looked at local government reorganisation and those sorts of things, lots of those areas that have moved to unitary status, actually parish and town councils have been a really important part of that, because even if you're doing things at scale, at some point you do need to get right down to place. So you need that level of granularity. So I think it's about deciding where things sit best. And I think some things will sit better at maybe a regional level or a higher level, and some things will definitely sit better really down in the community. So I don't think, again, it's about not being wedded to an idea because it's but just working out what's going to deliver the outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Cool. We'll open it up to the floor. Courtney is going to be the voice of the people online, so I'll come to you at some point. But if people want to put their hands up, and I'll just randomly pick a couple of people to kick us off. So I think I saw Tom's hand go first, and then Rayhan. So yeah, you're going to need a microphone as well. Samaya's going to. Thank you, Samaya. So yeah, Tom and then Rayhan.
Great, thanks very much to the panel. Tom Polk from the Institute for Government. I'm interested in thoughts from the panel on what public service devolution actually looks like in practice. So I think actually combined authorities so far have mostly been viewed as kind of vehicles of economic policy. If you look at the Trailblazer deals, it's really focusing on, there are clearly public service elements, for example, to housing, but the focus is really on transport skills, some employment support in there. There's not been that much on, particularly since the original 2015 deal on health, for example. And there is that model of kind of some role for the CA in Manchester on local NHS stuff, but that's quite a complicated model. I'm not really sure what it would mean, for example, for there to be more control over schools, more control over the NHS, and what the role would be for Wes Streeting, say, in that world. And linked to Ian's point on the last one, what do we think the right scale for devolution on public services is? Because combined authorities is a big focus on, is it a coherent economic geography? Yeah. Precisely because it's economic policies that we're devolving. And so that's really important. Is there a different set of considerations that we need for public services?
Two great questions there, Tom. I'll let you guys think about them. Do you want to take Rayhan's question as well? Yes.
Thanks, everyone. And I just want to say, I appreciate hearing what you had to say, Alex. And I applaud you for taking a good look at the local trusts, big local model. I spent 2.5 happy years there working with Matt Leach, and they're definitely an example when it comes to community power and how you make it work. So there's a couple of things I'd like to say is I'd also implore you to look at social investment businesses' work delivering a new Labour initiative called Future Builders back in the day during 2004 to 2012. And what this initiative did was provide social investment funding to charities and social enterprises to bid for and win and then deliver public service provision. And it has been a game changer. And we're soon going to be releasing data which shows that it had a serious impact in reducing deprivation in areas that benefited compared to surrounding areas, as well as obviously improving their economic output. So that's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd like to say is around a bold aspiration that Keir Starmer made, which is to lead the most devolutionary government this country has ever seen, which I think is absolutely the mark to aim for. But where I feel Labour is slightly weak on its devolution prospectus is around giving mayors and regional leaders the tax raising powers, the fiscal tools they need to really drive local change and improve public service delivery. For example, the Mayor of London only has 7% of the tax raises that are raised in the capital to spend himself. And we've obviously heard about tourism taxes, and I know Labour is looking at that in a very positive light. But it'd be good just to get a sense from you, where are Labour likely to land in terms of giving those powers to directly elected regional leaders? And in 5 years' time, what can we expect? In 10 years' time, what can we expect?
You're right to just, whoever wants to take this first, but to summarise, we had a pretty crunchy one from Tom. What does public service devolution look like in practice? So what on earth are we actually going to be devolving? Because we've basically done economic policy, not really done much social policy. And how does that relate to the scale question? Because combined authorities are structured around functional economic areas. Is that the right scale geography for devolution of public services? And then Rayhan's question was a plug for social investment businesses and a nice easy one on fiscal devolution. So I'm going to just force Alex to start on this one, and then we'll come to others. Yeah.
Let me take fiscal devolution on. I might leave the others to colleagues. I thought, maybe I could bat out the whole session without getting this, but I don't think that was ever going to happen. And I think Rachel's still out of the country, but I don't think that means that I'm going to get away with quite setting policy on that this evening. So you may have to forgive me to a degree that, as you know, we are deeply in the midst of the policy formation process. That will come through our National Policy Forum in July and then to conference in October. So there's a little bit of watch this space on that. I mean, I think I'd say that I would chunk them up a bit. So we've got in Nottingham, we fought really hard for it. It's taken us so long, but we've got a workplace parking levy. So if you've got more than 10 parking spaces at your business, you pay extra per space. That money goes into running our light rail and our bus system. A great idea. It was really painful to win that argument with the public, but win it we did. And we've had that now for probably best part of a decade. And those sort of things, the tourism, bed tax just seems so obvious, that where communities want to do that, where they think it'd be beneficial, and where they can have that, win that argument with their public. Well, I don't think we should stand in their way on that. So that bit I think is fine. The next bit I think gets trickier. The thing that makes me go kind of, is that our best example of it at the moment, and I know council tax has its many peculiarities and challenges, but that's our best kind of local varied tax, isn't it? And I know that communities like mine that are pretty much the worst off, we actually have considerably higher than average council tax, because we've got virtually no self-funders in social care and high degrees of young people in children's social care. So there's a bit to me that makes me worry that it won't deliver. That's the ability to vary won't deliver actually what we're trying to. Now there's the next step, as was in Rayhan's point around retaining money, and that kind of the difference to the Mayor of London, as Sadiq says, relative to others, is a point well made. I think as you move public services into the devolved settlement, that will start to move the dial, won't it? Because the funding will come with that. So that will come in time. So that's about as far as I think I can go on that. And then just on social investment, I'm very, very enthusiastic, my Labour and Co-op MP, about different models of ownership. And I'm really pleased to see that a couple of my Labour and Co-op colleagues have gone for community ownership hubs through their combined authorities. Ollie Coppard, I think Tracy as well. So I think that's those are sort of promising models. But we're really interested, Ryan, to see that data when you've got it. And then I might just finish on the scale point. So I think combined authorities, the scale actually that's not the issue. I think the scales are probably about right. Our challenges, and this is something about inheriting a settlement rather than writing one, is that our boundaries are going to be our biggest inhibitors. So, for example, it is brilliant, having mentioned Ollie, I'll mention him a second time, that Ollie's the chair I just saw this week of his integrated care board. That is a really good way of aligning the combined authority and the ICB. But that will be the exception, not the rule, not least because of the geographies don't neatly overlay. Now, what we can't do, and again, I know there's people with health specialties in here, but I don't think we can start disrupting the ICB footprints, because it's another change to the NHS. We've got to let these work, is my view. And that's before we get to policing and this kind of frustration about deals that can have policing in and can't because of the way whether those footprints marry. So, but the reality is that is what we're going to have to live with. And our local leaders are going to have to be canny and work around those, they do to an extent already. So, but because we're not going to get to a perfect, to Churchill's 12 kind of, 12 semi-autonomous blocks, that's not what the geography is going to be. So we're going to have to be more artful.
Cool. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, I absolutely, totally agree with that. And actually on those boundaries, it's really interesting because, of course, we've kind of, our deal's been all over the place. It was 12, then it was 7, then it was 3, then it was 6, then it was 7 local authorities. And so we've been all sorts of everything. And for a time we wondered whether policing would roll in. And I think where possible it should, but if you can't, then like Alex says, you've just got to be a bit more artful about how you manage these things. And I suppose to give you on the scale thing, a politician's answer on it, I'm very much about how people feel and about values. And I think sometimes what we miss in these conversations is what's their sense of belonging? You know, so I'm incredibly proud to be from the Northeast. I love the Northeast. That's why I want to represent the Northeast. And I think that is a definable identity. And that is quite a lot more important than whether our structures fit. And I think we need to be better at recognizing that when we're thinking particularly about devolution, which is a lot more about empowering communities. But to kind of answer some of the fabric of your question, transport's the obvious one, and it is pretty much the universally now, or will be the universally devolved public service alongside policing, which is to PCCs and mayors. But I think, you know, looking at things like housing, obviously skills are in a lot of the deals. Culture, I think, is really important, and to go to that tourist tax, I'm really keen on that idea. But let mayors choose how to decide how to spend it, and spend it on, you know, reinvesting it in culture and tourism, I think, is really important. And I think when you look specifically at housing, you know, I think, you know, Homes England at the moment, there's definitely an issue around the fact that you can only access funding for new houses. We've got huge issues around things like retrofitting, private rented sector. Those are very variable around different parts of the country. I think that's something that can be very easily, very comfortably devolved. And I think, you know, my list actually could pretty much go on, but I won't go on because you could do a whole different session on it. But I think it fits really nicely if you start to look at the whole picture. I think I wrote down something that Ian said, so I'll credit it, saying as he's still saying as he's still in the room, and I think it's about the totality of the place. It's not, you know, and the totality of what people's experience is. If we want to make our areas more wealthy, if we want growth, we need to look at the way people are living. We need to look at tackling social issues like child poverty, like social, like health inequality, like housing inequality, and all of those things. And we do that by pulling the social levers, but by doing it, we will also lift our economy. So I think it's circular. I'm not going to say anything more on tax, except that you can't just keep adding. And at the moment, you know, localized tax capability, so precepts, for example, which we have with policing, they are punitive, they're not equal, and you're just adding all the time. And so unless you're going to rip it up and start again, and people like me will inevitably push Rachel and Alex and Lisa, quite nudge them in the right direction towards more fiscal devolution, because that's our job, we will do that. But unless you rewrite it, you can't just keep adding.
Ian, do you want to come in on the...
Yeah, so we don't know where to start. So on the scale question, so I mean, really simplifies, but I think so combined authorities or regional levels for things like economic policy, I think some of those, I mean, even things like workforce issues, employment, those sorts of things, I think that feels about right. I think you need to be working with communities when it comes to things that are more directly relate to people. So actually, I mean, ICB's jury's out for me still, I think, but I think the NHS prior to that had done a lot of work looking at, or bits of the NHS had done lots of work looking at primary care in this country is broken. So how do you, if you looked at how you reform primary care around communities, the needs of communities, that would be a really really good start. ICBs might provide a model for further devolution. DH just doesn't work in the culture shift you'd have to make would be massive. On fiscal devolution, I mean, you could start with reforming what you already have. So if you looked at council tax is I think the values, so that the bandings are based in some point in the 1990s. So actually you have a tax that's not progressive and actually is based on a reference point that's decades old now. So there may be merit in looking at just reforming what you already have. And I think one of the things we hear talking to local government is actually the referendum, that referendum limit is it impairs accountability rather than enhances it, because everyone just goes to or near the max they can without triggering the referendum, and that means that actually there's very little. I mean, a lot of those also come with, I know in policing, it's, well, you're not getting any money through or flat in terms of grant, but you have freedoms to, to raise more money from your local taxpayers. But so I think there would be opportunities within what's already there to look at how you might adapt some of those models. And I think the role of I think the role of whether it's the third sector or or business in all of this is really, really important as well. And I think I think that comes back to the totality of the place. You need to understand who are the players in your area, what do they have to offer, and and exploring all vehicles for service delivery. And one of the great things about the third sector in particular is that they are from communities, they're working with communities, and they're able to get close to get that close granular understanding of what their needs are. So.
I suppose I just want to very quickly add one thing to what I said in answer to Tom's question about what does more public service devolution look like. I heard Lisa and Andy say a really groundbreaking thing, not that groundbreaking. We have to be okay with different parts of the country doing things in different ways. And actually that is also part of the answer to your question, is that some places will want different powers over different things, and because some places will have different social issues to solve. And I think that's really, really crucial and really important to say.
By the way, they already do.
Yeah.
Before I forget, can I go to Courtney and then to you, Polly? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
So Courtney's going to be the voice of...
It's quite a big responsibility, the voice of the entire internet. Yeah, so we've got a few, so I'll try and kind of summarise. Do you want them just all in one go?
How many you got?
Just want the easy one.
4?
4?
But
Pick the 3 best.
Oh, feels unfair. Well, someone's asked 2, so
very disgruntled online.
someone's asked 2, so they could just have one of them. So we've got, someone has characterised levelling up as being more like grinding down, and has asked how will the non-metro mayor cold spots be warmed up. Someone else has asked, kind of touching on what you're just mentioning there, what role do you see for the VCS sector in supporting devolved public services? And then we've had a question specifically about rail. So what kind of powers do panelists think it would be appropriate for mayors to hold in relation to rail, given that the rail industry requires such a high degree of expertise and long-term network-wide planning?
Rail, my favourite topic is the foremost public transport. That's 3 pretty crunchy ones. So is levelling up, grinding. Basically, what do we do about the places that don't have metro mayors? The cold spots, which I think is a nice turn of phrase from the internet there. Number 2, VCS sector. How do we get the third sector, charity sector, more involved in public service delivery? And what was the rail one specifically? Just like
given the complexity of the rail industry, they've basically given some context around Great British Railways says it will develop partnerships with mayoral design authorities to allow mayors to influence and improve the local rail offer. But there's not much detail. So kind of given that context and the complexity of rail.
So the future of devolution for rail. Wow, big questions. Kim, you want to start?
Yeah, go on. I'll have a go. So leveling, so I agree that levelling. I'm going to assume that this person thinks that levelling up hasn't really worked, and I think that I alluded to that in my opening remarks about the fact that the problem for me with it, that the summary, as Alex said, of the Levelling Up white paper, was nothing particularly wrong with that. There is something wrong with the fact that 240 odd pages of it didn't reference the fact that we've got growing levels of poverty, particularly child poverty in this country. It's not acknowledging what the fundamental social issues are, or certainly it's not acknowledging how to solve them. And I don't necessarily think that cold spots are where there aren't metro mayors. I think that there are some really deprived northern areas, particularly, where I represent in the northeast, for example, in the northeast. Tees Valley's had loads of money, which you would still say have been let down by the allocation of levelling up grants. And so my opinion is that what we have to get better at doing is prioritizing those social issues and where they live, rather than the bidding contest thing where you just empower areas to only be able to bid if they've got a mayor. So I think it's again about that community empowerment. I don't know exactly how you do that, but there's got to be a way. There's enough smart brains in government to figure out how you do that, how you devolve that finance in a much more holistic way and stop this kind of constant bidding all the time. And I think it's as simple as that, mayor or not. Although I do fundamentally believe that having a single accountable person is a good thing. The VCS sector's got to be a huge part of this. The voluntary sector, for me, has picked up a whole range of government failings when it comes to austerity. You know, we already have got vital public services being delivered by the voluntary sector. The trick is to choose to do it that way because it's better. And so, you know, prioritizing what the voluntary sector can do better than we can. You know, some of this is deciding that our regions and our local areas can make better decisions than central government. Some of those decisions have to be about who's best to deliver things. And so considering the expertise in the voluntary sector is, I think, really vital. I do a lot of this through commissioning of things like victim services, services that prevent violence. And you know, there is a deliberate decision to do those things in the voluntary sector because it's the right place for them, not because it's a convenient place to hide austerity. And I think that's really important. Rail, you know, I agree with whoever has put the question in. It does take a whole lot of expertise, but what mayors can be is the voice of the people who are travelling on the railways, and not just the railways, but kind of across the whole public transport network. I don't think it's appropriate for me to tell them operationally how to run a train timetable. That's bonkers. You know, in the same way as a police and crime commissioner, I don't tell them exactly where to direct their resources. And it's about being the voice of the people to the people who are establishing the infrastructure, and crucially who are establishing the contracts. You know, if it is vital for people in my region to be able to travel out of it elsewhere and back into it again, I think that we should have a seat at the table when we're determining who is given those contracts. And I think we should have a seat at the table when we're determining whether or not they're doing well.
Alex, do you want to come in on the kind of cold spots, VCS or rail?
Yeah, well, I'll have a quick tilt at the lot if you don't mind. I mean, because the GBR point's become even foggier in recent days because now we don't know what we are on doing. Because one thing we haven't addressed in this conversation is, so if we're advocating for a significant transfer of power from the centre out to nations, regions, sub-regions, what left for the centre, right? And actually, I think that rail fits in that, in the sense that the things that we don't do well in this country, big, you know, we don't do infrastructure very well, we don't do those big projects very well. You know, actually, it's a very good thing for Parliament and the centre to be doing with those, right, as you say, giving the voice to those communities affected through their representatives. I think that's actually quite a nice balance. And if you know, I said this the other day, but nobody thinks that we're doing too well in Westminster. You know, nobody says, "Oh goodness, those guys just you everywhere you look, those guys deliver." Like, so maybe taking something, and there are a variety of reasons, and I might make a strong case for 13 years of those afterwards when we're having a drink, but there is also something structurally too about doing too many things and not doing them well enough. So this is one of those things, actually, I think that could be a focus. I mean, on the community and voluntary sector point, I mean, that for me is that's the double devolution conversation. Yeah. You know, that is the way into the system. We also know, and it's great as well, and this is, you know, you see this in the West Midlands as well as Greater Manchester and everywhere else. I'm not making a party political point on this, but if you look at who the mayors have put in their combined authorities, it's really interesting that who they value in the room, and that, you know, politicians of the left always have their businesses in there, and politicians of the right still have their trade union people in there. So it's really interesting, perhaps when no one's looking, the values they put on that. But crucially, everybody has got at least some representation from the VCS, but you need to move that to meaningful, you know, involvement in the decision making, and we've spoken a little bit about that. And then on the cold spots, I mean, again, I have to be a little bit cute because we're not quite at announcement stage on this, but I don't want to hold out on you entirely. Every time we have a kind of big financial event, new funding will be announced, and generally Jeremy Hunt says half will go to the mayoral combined authorities and half everyone else can fight for the rest. That sort of thing creates cold spots that don't serve a public policy goal other than whacking people who don't conform to a government preferred way of doing things, that in many cases haven't even been given the option to do that. They're not even in the deals in the potential deals in the levelling up white paper. So I'm not even sure what it is, whether it's macho, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it doesn't serve. So what we actually see, and there's some phenomenal research has come out this from recently from CELUP on this. If you look what that's done to funding allocations, you couldn't explain it to a dispassionate observer. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. So we could at least move away from that, and that would at least ameliorate some of the coldness.
But nothing to add on the rail point, and actually I think that is, it is the role there is accountability and the voice of your residents, I think, in dealing with that. I've sort of talked about the third sector a bit. I think that's really important. I think, building on what Kim was saying, that's about effective commissioning and about understanding who's best placed to deliver against what it is you're trying to achieve. And I suppose the only thing I would offer on maybe what we have now is that I think the danger in the way that levelling up funding has worked is that you encourage people to bid for either what they might want or what they think others might want them to want, rather than what they actually need. And I think the way that you address those cold spots is that you understand what the needs are, and then you fund to address need, rather than creating the situation where the beauty parade where everyone is sort of trying to present the shiny new thing rather than what's actually needed. The only thing I was going to add to probably the previous answer was actually I suppose is thinking about, so at the moment the silo busting thing, I suppose, is part of the challenge, isn't it? So you get the various operators in an area, they're all trying to do the right thing, but they're all constrained in some way. And I think one of the things, local government doesn't always use it well, but does have this sort of general power of competence. So that thing where if you can make a case for how what you're doing is going to benefit your local area, then but that isn't the same for police. That isn't the same for NHS. And we've tried the attempts at things like statutory obligation or statutory duty to collaborate and those sorts of things, but they don't really cut the mustard. So I mean, looking at partnership models where people are actually able to say, I'm willing to put my money in here into transport because I know if I spend the money in transport, I'm going to actually achieve the thing that I'm being asked to achieve, which is reduction in reduction in antisocial behaviour. And I think getting more comfortable with that as that's the way to break those silos down. Is, well, what benefits the resident? What benefits the at the end of the day? If we can ask ourselves that question and answer that question convincingly, then it shouldn't really matter which particular pot the funding is coming from.
I keep doing this, and obviously it makes me look like I'm desperate to have the last word. That's not the case. It's because I'm thinking I'm listening while we're talking. But part of the reason that levelling up funding has failed and other biddable pots like that don't work is because part of the political decision making is not to allocate enough to go around. Yeah. And so, a lot of government's devolution policy, I think, is designed to mask austerity. And what it fundamentally does is it goes, right, here's a problem that people have flagged. Here's a problem. So I'll keep on antisocial behaviour because it's a nice easy one to talk about. Antisocial behaviour is a problem. We're going to throw 20 million at it. That'll solve the problem. But you need to spend it by next March, and you have to bid for it. And you have to bid for it, and we're going to allocate it, and we'll tell you whether or not your problem's bad enough to solve. But you've got to spend it by next March. And so part of the reason these things are failing, as well as the fact that they're allocated in the way that they're allocated, is because they have to be allocated at all, and because they don't allocate enough money in the first place to solve the problem. And I think, going back to, I think, Ian's very opening address and the decisions around long-term devolution of funding, what we don't think about enough in the public sector, or we think about it and talk about it a lot, but we don't do it enough, is recognise that often investment up front will save us a fortune down the line. And a lot of this stuff is exactly that.
Cool. So I'm going to take some questions from the floor. Polly, put your hand up if you want to be counted. So over there, any more from the floor? Probably take one more, and then that's probably time.
Thank you. So I, like, sticking with the consensus theme, I agree with everything that's been said. The thing that's been bugging me through the conversation is whether this kind of this consensus on devolution is going to address the original problem, which was how people feel in their local areas, and that kind of take back control, that post-referendum feeling, that pre-referendum feeling. Is is this kind of devolution going to rebuild the trust? And in the context of public services, actually, is there something more in the quality of public services and the engagement around public services and how we relate to the real public servants in our life that will help on that? And so that's the question that's bugging me, and the question I'll take into Demos. But my question to you guys is, what's the big unanswered question for you in terms of how we do devolution and support public service reform for it? So to help shape our thinking, what are you really stuck on?
Hello. So the question that's bugging me is we're having a whole conversation about the devolution of public services without talking about public sector pay. And public sector pay is negotiated behind closed doors in Whitehall. It covers millions of public sector workers. And I'd just be interested in the view of the panel of whether devolution of public sector pay negotiations or a different way of negotiating public sector pay might be part of what your vision for public sector devolution of public services looks like.
Thanks. So I think we have some very big sort of monolithic public services, 20th century kind of transactional models often, and I don't think only through devolution can we get to more participatory kind of civic services. So I'm massively in favour of it. Having been on the Greater Manchester Public Service Reform team back in sort of 2014-15 when we did the early deals, the barriers we kept hitting were kind of professional and regulatory expectations, and kind of how you move money around. So accounting rules that run down from departments. And I think if we're going to allow, if we're going to think about devolution in public services, we need to think about variation in public services, and who's accountable for that variation, right? So if I'm a mayor, do I actually want to be accountable for variation in services in a climate that can be very punitive when things go wrong? And if I'm a minister, do I want to allow other people to take those risks when ultimately I may be accountable as well? So I think there's a bit of a kind of a catch-22. It's the right thing to do. It's very hard to do without unbundling the national sort of performance and accountability systems we have already.
Big one to end on. I'm just going to grab. So kind of got 3-4 minutes left, so I'm going to come for fairly quick responses to those big questions, and these are your final chance to get anything across that you wanted to say. So yeah, we'll basically, Polly's one was like, what's the big unanswered question you guys are thinking about in this space? 2, public sector pay, small one to finish on. Are we going to devolve that as well? It's a really good question. And then an interesting question around sort of appetite for variability across the country that comes with devolution. How do we manage that and the potential risks around that? So yeah, Alex, Ian, who wants to kick us off? Kim, Ian can start.
I'll go. So big. So I have my concern, capacity and capability. I think and it may be linked to the public sector pay point as well, actually. So I think after a period of disinvestment in public services, do you have enough people with the right skills in the existing the frameworks that we have at the moment to be able to deliver against this agenda? So I think there's a nagging doubt there, and I'm not a politician, so I can say it. So I think part of the answer would be actually you do need to we should be devolving some of those decisions into local bodies so that they can make decisions about who they employ, on what basis, and in the same way that any other business would. So from putting all of the difficulties with that to one side, I can see the merits of that as an idea. I think the completely recognise what you're describing. I think particularly if we looked at that sort of key interface between social care and the NHS at the moment, you've got two systems playing by completely different rules, incentivised completely differently, and part of the solution has to be trying to align some of those incentives to make that work. So and some of that is is just a product of the way that we account for stuff, frankly. So I mean I think that's acknowledged, and the Hewitt review actually picked up on that, and there are some recommendations in that which fortunately we were named in, and we'll be looking to work through what that all means. So but I do think that it comes back to the point made earlier, which is there are examples where it does work. Manchester is an example where lots of that has been worked through, and some of that is about asking yourself the question: does it really matter which bit of the public's money is being spent if it's for the public benefit? And I think if we can start to ask that question a bit more regularly, you probably find some of the creative solutions to answer some of those problems.
Thank you, Alex. Any thoughts on the questions? Final remarks. 1 minute or so.
Yeah, I mean the reason that health and social care integration doesn't work is exactly that point, is because there's just too many differing incentives. So until we start to align them, but this is the perfect way to do it, creating is place-based policy making, which again, lots of people in this room have been talking about for a very long time. So we have to find that alignment if you're going to have success. On public sector pay, no, I have to say that isn't something I would devolve. Keir has made in recent days, obviously the commitment he's made around simplifying negotiation units. So, they've been atomized for a reason, but the root is that there's not been a value in paying our public services perceived in government, that they don't understand where healthcare assistants actually spend their money. And that is, I think, the problem on the pay end rather than the negotiation end. I think we do much better there. And then on Polly, on the unanswered question, I mean, I know there's lots of people in this room interested in this. You've heard what I've said, you've heard what Lisa said, you've heard what Rachel said on fiscal devolution. If we're wrong, now's the time to tell us and to give us, what you think's a workable option on that. We are still always in the market for good ideas. So please, that would be one I'd suggest you focus on. But as with anything else, I will steal your ideas all the time. So please keep giving them me. Yeah.
Any final remarks?
I think to answer the question about kind of the variables, you've just got to commit, right? And again, that's not a technical or a policy answer. You've just got to commit. You've got to devolve the whole thing and do it properly, and then you roll with the punches of risk and accountability, and you leave those in local hands, and that's kind of part of the job. And I think we have to accept that, but that also means a central government accepting the wins that will be taken locally, potentially by someone of a different party, and all of those political things that go along with it. I think on public sector pay, I'd need to give that a lot more thought. But one thing I completely agree with Alex, that there's been a devaluation of the work performed by the public sector, and this will lead to my unanswered question. And that constant devaluation has meant that they're just leaving the public sector in their droves, and they're going to a private sector that values them more. And we've got to stop that, because it simply doesn't work. And so for me, the biggest problem is the parameters that are set by those by the government on those national pay bodies. And then the constant chipping away and the weakening of trade union rights. We need to bolster those and give our trade unions, in my humble opinion, a greater seat at the table to represent people properly. And I think that's really important. And so my biggest unanswered question is how, it is going to be a very difficult job to deliver for people in a world where our public services have been completely attacked by austerity, and where we're still hemorrhaging people. And so it's how do we, at the same time as devolving more power into local areas, how do we rebuild what we already had to the strength where we're able to deliver on people's behalf in those local areas?
A great note to finish on, Kim. Thank you so much. So stay around for a drink. We do these events every month. You find out about them on our website. Please do hang around if you can. Let's give panelists and all you guys for your great questions a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.